On a bone-chilling Alaskan night, Warren Pierce opened his cabin door to two gaunt wolves, trembling on his porch. What desperate secret drove these wild creatures to seek a human's help? And how would their arrival transform his life forever? It was a freezing winter night in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness, the kind of night where the wind howls like a lost spirit, and even the trees seem to groan under the weight of snow and time. Inside a small, weather-beaten log cabin, Warren Pierce was preparing for another long, quiet night alone. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting golden flickers against the walls, and the familiar creaks of the cabin roof were oddly comforting. Warren had lived here most of his life. He was used to the silence, the stillness, the endless expanse of snow. The wilderness had become his home, his companion, and at times, his burden. But that night, something changed. Just as Warren settled into his worn leather armchair with a mug of hot tea and an old novel, a strange sound broke through the silence, a faint, almost hesitant scratching at his front door, followed by soft, muffled whines that barely rose above the wind. At first, he thought it must be a stray dog, or maybe even the wind playing tricks on him, but the sound came again, more urgent this time, and something about it made his heart quicken. Rising from his chair, he walked to the window and wiped away the fog with his sleeve. What he saw made him freeze. Just beyond the porch, barely visible through the blowing snow, were two wolves. Not just any wolves. They looked half dead, their once thick coats now soaked, matted and dusted with ice. Their bodies were thin, bones pushing through their fur like fragile scaffolding. They weren't growling, they weren't baring their teeth, they were shivering, trembling, and staring at the door with eyes that didn't seem wild at all. Their eyes didn't show aggression or hunger in the way wolves normally did. They showed something that caught Warren off guard: sorrow, pain, and something eerily close to pleading. It was as if they weren't asking to come in. They were begging. The bigger of the two stood guard, head lowered in caution, but the smaller one, a younger wolf barely standing, gave a weak, breathy howl that seemed more like a cry for help than a threat. Warren's hand rested on the doorknob, heart pounding in his chest, torn between everything he had learned about wild predators, and something deeper inside him that told him these animals weren't here to hurt him. They were lost. They were cold, and maybe, just maybe, they were looking for someone, anyone, to save them. His cabin, this modest wooden shelter in the middle of nowhere, suddenly felt like something more than a refuge for one man. It felt like it had become a beacon, a final hope for something wild and beautiful that the world had turned its back on. And Warren, a man who had chosen to live away from people for most of his life, was faced with a choice that no one could have prepared him for. Let them in and risk danger, or close the door and live with the weight of turning away a desperate life. His mind raced with questions. How had they gotten here? Were they separated from a pack? Were they starving, injured? But questions didn't matter in that moment. Instinct did. Not the kind of instinct that warns of danger, but the kind that urges compassion. Against every bit of logic in his head, Warren slowly opened the door just a crack. The wind howled in, cold and sharp, making the flames in the fireplace dance. The wolves didn't move at first. Then the smaller one took a shaky step forward, its paw leaving a faint imprint in the snow. It looked up at him, not like an animal looking at a man, but like a soul meeting another soul. Something about its gaze cut deep. The bigger wolf remained still, cautious, alert, but Warren didn't feel fear. Not like before. He felt something different, a pull, a sense of quiet understanding. He opened the door wider and stepped back. The wolves didn't charge in, they didn't snarl. They stepped over the threshold slowly, as if sensing the sacredness of the moment, as if they knew this wasn't normal for either of them. The warmth of the cabin wrapped around them instantly, and the younger one let out a soft, almost relieved whimper. Snow melted off their fur and dripped onto the wooden floor, but Warren didn't care. He watched them, hardly believing what was happening. Two wolves, inside his home, not as enemies, not as threats, but as guests, maybe even something more. He shut the door behind them gently, sealing out the cold. For a moment, none of them moved. The wolves stood still, wide-eyed, as if trying to make sense of this strange kindness. Warren didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he'd made a terrible mistake. But in that quiet cabin, warmed by fire and faith, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long, long time. Connection. And somewhere deep inside, in a place words can't reach, he knew that this moment would change everything. Not just for the wolves, but for him too. Because when the wild knocks on your door, trembling, starving, lost, and you choose to open it, you're not just saving them, you're saving a part of yourself that you forgot was still there. Warren stood frozen in place, one hand still resting on the wooden doorknob, the cold wind slipping through the narrow crack between the frame and the door, brushing against his face like the breath of the forest itself. For years he had lived in this remote part of Alaska, deep in the wilderness, where nature ruled without apology. He had weathered countless storms, faced down bears and blizzards, and learned to live by rules older than civilization. One of those rules was simple: never trust a wolf. Yet here he was, heart pounding, watching two wolves just a few feet away from crossing the line between outside and in. They were no longer just shadows in the snow. They were real, trembling creatures, gaunt and fragile, standing on the edge of survival. The bigger wolf's posture remained alert, cautious, its body shielding the smaller one, but Warren could see the strain in its legs, the way it stood like it had forgotten how to rest. The smaller wolf looked even worse, thin as a skeleton, its eyes half closed with exhaustion. Still, in both their faces there was something human, something raw and naked, that had nothing to do with being wild or dangerous. They looked tired, not just physically, but soul deep, as if the wind, the hunger, the separation from their kind, had worn down every instinct they had, leaving only one thing left: the will to survive, and the hope that someone, somewhere might show them mercy. Warren knew the risk. He wasn't foolish. He had seen what wolves could do to a man who caught them on the wrong day, and his instincts screamed for him to slam the door shut, bolt it, and pretend this never happened. But something inside him, something older than fear, rose up instead. Maybe it was the years of living alone, the long winters filled with silence and no voices but the ones in his memories. Maybe it was the loneliness that crept in during the darkest nights, whispering that even a man surrounded by nature could still feel completely and utterly alone. Or maybe it was simply the look in the wolf's eyes, a look that said, "We don't want to hurt you, we just don't want to die tonight." That look shattered something in Warren, and without fully realizing it, he opened the door wide. The wind pushed inside, bringing flakes of snow that swirled onto the wooden floor like tiny ghosts. Warren stepped back slowly, lifting one hand in a soft gesture of welcome, though his breath caught in his throat. The wolves didn't move right away. The bigger one sniffed the air, nostrils twitching, then looked at the smaller one. It was like they were having a silent conversation, a final vote between fear and hope. And then, with trembling steps, they crossed the threshold. Their paws made almost no sound on the wood. Only the soft rhythmic dripping of melting snow from their fur broke the silence. Warren backed further into the cabin, giving them space, his heart pounding like a drum in his chest. The wolves stood just inside the door, breathing heavily, eyes scanning every corner of the room. Warren could see the hesitation in their muscles, the way they flinched at each creak of the old floorboards. But they didn't bolt, they didn't growl. Instead, they slowly eased toward the warmth of the fireplace, like they knew they were safe, if only for a little while. Warren stood still, barely daring to breathe. He watched them like one might watch a miracle happening in real time, not with fear, but with reverence. He had opened his home, a place that had known only one heartbeat for years, to these two creatures of the wild. And instead of chaos, he was met with something unexpectedly tender. The bigger wolf lay down first, curling its body protectively around the smaller one, who struggled before finally resting its head against its sibling's chest. Warren didn't speak, he didn't move. In that moment, he felt like the forest itself had come to rest inside his cabin, not as a storm, but as a whisper. Something about that silent surrender, that acceptance, reached into places inside Warren that had long been closed off, places touched by old grief, long forgotten dreams, and memories of people he once held dear but had lost to time. He remembered his father's lessons, back when he was just a boy: never feed the wild, never blur the line. But his father had also taught him kindness, and in that memory, Warren found his answer. These wolves had come to his door not as beasts, but as living testaments to pain, survival and trust. And in opening that door, Warren wasn't just offering them warmth, he was letting in something he didn't know he needed: connection, a chance to matter again, a reason to hope. As the fire crackled and the snow continued to fall outside, the cabin filled with a different kind of silence, not the empty silence of loneliness, but the peaceful quiet of hearts beginning to understand each other, across the distance of species, instinct and fear. And for the first time in years, Warren didn't feel alone. He felt human, he felt needed, and he realized that sometimes, doing the thing that makes no sense, the thing that goes against every warning and rule, is the one act that can bring you back to life. He had chosen kindness, and in return, he received something far greater than safety. He received a flicker of purpose, a glimmer of meaning, and it all began the moment he opened his door and let the wild walk in. The warmth inside the cabin wrapped around the wolves like a thick, invisible blanket, but warmth alone wasn't enough. As Warren watched the two creatures lying close to the fire, still dripping snow and barely moving, he noticed something else: hunger. Not just the kind that gnaws at your belly, but the kind that creeps into your bones and makes your whole body ache. The smaller wolf, still curled tightly beside its sibling, gave a faint whimper, and that sound tugged at something deep inside Warren's chest. He hadn't heard a sound like that in a long time. So soft, so helpless, like a whisper from something on the edge of giving up. The bigger wolf opened one eye and looked at Warren, not with anger or threat, but with quiet, careful attention. Its posture was tense, protective, and it was clear that this creature had taken on the role of guardian. Warren recognized that kind of look. It reminded him of his younger days, when his mother was sick, and he stood watch over her in silence, unsure how to help, but desperate to do something, anything. That same kind of silent devotion lived in the eyes of the larger wolf, and it struck him in a place beyond logic. Slowly, Warren turned toward his small kitchen, the wood floor creaking beneath his boots. He wasn't rich in supplies. Living off the land in Alaska taught you to use what you had and waste nothing, but some things were worth giving, even if it meant going without for a little while. He opened the modest pantry where he kept smoked meat and dried rations. His fingers paused over a pack of venison he had planned to use for stew that week. He stared at it, thinking of the effort it had taken to prepare, to save, to ration. But then he looked back at the wolves, at the smaller one, ribs showing through its matted fur, and at the way it kept shifting, as though the pain in its leg wouldn't let it rest. And just like that, the decision was made. He grabbed the venison, cut it into small chunks with a hunting knife, dulled from years of use, and placed it on a metal plate. He wasn't sure what wolves ate in this condition, and there was a whisper of fear that feeding them raw meat might awaken some feral instinct. But when he walked back into the living room and gently placed the plate down near the fire, far enough to give them space, but close enough for them to smell it, he didn't feel afraid. He felt hopeful. The smell must have reached them almost immediately. The smaller wolf sniffed the air and lifted its head weakly. The bigger one turned fully, eyes locked on Warren, then on the meat. It didn't lunge or growl. Instead, it stood slowly, cautiously, like an old soldier approaching uncertain ground. With silent steps, it came forward, sniffed the food, then looked once more at Warren, as if asking for permission. Warren took a step back and lowered his gaze, trying to seem as unthreatening as possible. The wolf lowered its head and took the first bite, then another. Then, unable to hold back, the smaller wolf tried to stand, but its leg gave out. It let out a soft cry of pain, and before Warren could move, the bigger wolf turned, nudged its sibling gently, and helped steady it until it could reach the plate. Together they ate, side by side, sharing each bite with urgency, but without competition. It was clear they had gone a long time without food. Their jaws moved fast, but not wildly. There was no snapping, no snarling, just the desperate rhythm of survival. As Warren watched, he felt a knot forming in his throat. There was something about seeing them eat, these two once proud predators, reduced to trembling shadows of themselves, that made him ache in ways he hadn't in years. They weren't just feeding their body, they were feeding their will to live. And it wasn't just hunger that they shared, it was pain, fear, love, and the heavy weight of having made it this far, when so many don't. The bigger wolf never stopped watching the smaller one, gently nudging pieces of meat closer, stepping back when it needed more room. It was a protector, a guardian, a silent warrior, who had likely endured as much heartbreak as the snow could bear. Warren thought back to the days after his father passed, when he had sat in this very cabin, surrounded by food, but unable to eat, because grief had stolen his appetite. It was his younger brother then, now long gone, who had quietly placed a bowl in front of him, and said nothing, just sat there, refusing to leave until Warren took a bite. He remembered that moment now, remembered the look in his brother's eyes, the same look he saw in the bigger wolf, a look that said, "You're not alone, I'm here, keep going." The plate was empty within minutes, licked clean, and for a moment the room was still again, filled only with the soft sounds of breathing, and the quiet hum of fire. The wolves lay back down, their stomachs fuller but their eyes still wary. Warren fetched a bowl of clean water, placed it near them, and once again stepped back. They drank slowly, cautious. The smaller wolf let its head rest on its sibling's back when it finished, and Warren could feel the tension in the room begin to lift, like a storm passing. He sat down in his old chair, leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, and exhaled. He felt something loosen inside him, something that had been clenched for years. Maybe it was grief, or maybe it was the deep ache of a man who had seen too much winter alone. Whatever it was, it began to melt, just a little. These weren't just wild animals, they were family. Not in the human sense of names and bloodlines, but in the way that only those who have survived together can be family. They had held each other up through the cold, shielded each other from death, and now, here in his home, they had shown Warren that even in the wildest places, love still mattered. It existed, it endured, and sometimes, it walked on four legs, shaking and hungry, hoping someone would open a door. As night fell over the Alaskan wilderness, the storm outside grew stronger, but inside Warren's cabin, something softer began to settle. The wild wind rattled the windows and moaned through the trees, but it no longer felt threatening. It felt distant, like a bad memory fading slowly. The crackling fire gave off a steady warmth, its flickering glow painting gentle shadows on the wooden walls. The wolves, now fed and somewhat calmer, had curled themselves into tight circles near the hearth, their bodies finally relaxing after what must have been days, maybe weeks of constant fear and cold. The smaller wolf lay with its head resting against the bigger one, whose eyes occasionally opened to scan the room before closing again, as if still guarding but beginning to trust. Warren sat back in his favorite old chair, the one with the frayed arms and cushion worn thin, holding a book he had read dozens of times, but he didn't read much that night. His eyes kept drifting toward the two shapes on his floor, two lives that only hours ago were nothing more than a danger in the dark, and now rested within reach of his hand. There was no sound but the fire, the occasional soft sigh from one of the wolves, and the distant howl of wind outside. But it was not an empty silence. It was full, rich, meaningful. It was the kind of silence that says more than words ever could. Warren felt something unfamiliar tug at his chest, a feeling he hadn't welcomed in years. Not exactly joy, not quite peace, but something in between, something warm. He remembered nights long ago when his wife was still alive, and they would sit together in the same room, the same fire lighting their faces. Sometimes they didn't talk for hours, yet the silence had always been comforting, like a quiet handshake between souls. Tonight felt strangely similar, not because the wolves were people, but because something about their presence filled the empty spaces in the room, in the same way his wife's company once had. It was not about speech or understanding, it was about being, just being together, alive, breathing, safe for now. That was enough. At one point, The smaller wolf let out a soft whimpering noise in its sleep, its body twitching, as if running through a dream. The larger wolf shifted closer, placing a paw protectively over its sibling. Warren watched the gesture, and it moved him deeply. He saw in that small act the kind of quiet care we all need but rarely ask for, a simple gesture that said, "I'm here, you're not alone." He felt a lump rise in his throat. How strange, he thought, that creatures like this, creatures he had once feared, could show a kind of love that humans often forgot how to express. As the fire crackled and shadows danced across the log walls, Warren closed his book, not bothering to mark the page. It didn't matter. The words on the page couldn't compete with the story unfolding silently in front of him. He sat back, eyes half closed, letting the warmth of the room wrap around him like an old familiar blanket. He wasn't sure how long he sat like that. Time seemed to stretch and fold in that kind of stillness, bending the hours into one long quiet breath. The wolves didn't move much, just the occasional twitch of an ear, or a soft exhale through a damp nose. Warren listened to their breathing, and found it calming. Their breaths became like a metronome, steady and alive, reminding him that even in the dead of winter, life still found a way to keep going. At one point, he reached down slowly, cautiously, and picked up a worn quilt from the side of the cabin. Moving gently, he laid it near the wolves, not on them, but beside them, close enough for them to feel the gesture, far enough not to startle them. The larger wolf opened its eyes and watched him, unblinking, but didn't move. Warren nodded slightly, a silent truth. He returned to his chair, hands folded in his lap, eyes on the fire once more. He didn't need them to understand him. He didn't need to pet them or speak to them or turn this moment into something more than what it was. Just having them here, alive and breathing, was enough to remind him that life could still surprise him. That kindness, even in the smallest measure, could return something unexpected. Hours passed. The fire burned low, but Warren added another log without getting up, nudging it with his foot as he had done 1,000 times before. The heat pulsed gently through the room, and he felt his own eyelids growing heavy. He thought of the many nights he had spent in that cabin alone, how the silence had once felt heavy and endless, but tonight it was a different kind of quiet, a shared silence, one that didn't need to be broken. It was in that shared space between breath and stillness that Warren realized he no longer felt like just a man in the woods. He felt like someone who had been chosen not by destiny or fate, but by circumstance, by the moment, by these two wild souls, who had come to his door in desperation and decided to trust him. He wondered if they could sense what they had given him. Not just their presence, but a reason to feel something again, to care again. And as he finally leaned his head back against the cushion, letting sleep creep into his bones, he whispered a quiet thank you, not expecting them to understand, but hoping somehow that they'd. Outside the wind howled on, but inside Warren slept beside the fire, a man no longer alone, in a cabin where the wild had come, not to conquer but to rest. Morning arrived gently, not with brightness, but with a soft silver light that slid through the frosted windows and cast a quiet shimmer over the room. Warren stirred slowly from sleep, stiff from the night in his old chair, but warmed by the soft crackle of the fire that still glowed faintly. For a moment, he forgot they were there, the wolves, and when he looked down and saw them still curled by the hearth, he felt a deep, peaceful sort of relief. They were alive, still with him. The larger wolf was awake, alert as always, its head raised, and eyes locked on Warren, but the smaller one remained curled tightly, breathing shallowly. As Warren moved to stoke the fire, he noticed something that hadn't registered fully the night before. The smaller wolf's hind leg was swollen, twisted slightly in a way that didn't look natural. It wasn't just hunger or cold that had weakened it. There was real pain here, the kind of injury that didn't just go away with rest. Warren's stomach turned at the thought. How long had it been limping through the snow like that? How far had they come together with one injured, and the other refusing to leave its side? He crouched slowly, carefully, keeping his movements smooth, as he got closer to the wolves. The larger one tensed, its muscles tightening, But it didn't growl, it just watched him. The smaller wolf shifted uncomfortably, its ears flicking, but didn't try to move away. Warren sat on his knees a few feet from them, heart pounding, whispering softly, as if his voice could wrap around them like the warmth from the fire. "It's all right," he said, even though he knew they couldn't understand the words. But maybe, just maybe, they could understand the tone, the softness, the intent. He reached out, slowly, inch by inch, until his hand hovered above the injured leg. The wolf flinched, a low sound escaping its throat, more a cry of discomfort than threat. Warren didn't rush. He pulled his hand back, gave it space, then tried again. This time the wolf only trembled. The larger wolf had moved closer, standing now but still didn't interfere. It simply stood by, like a worried sibling, watching with quiet intensity. Warren leaned back and rose to fetch his old first aid kit, the same one he'd kept in his cabin for years but rarely used. Inside were bits and pieces, gauze, a small bottle of antiseptic, wrinkled bandages from a time long ago. He returned to the wolves, knelt again, and laid the kit gently on the ground. He showed them everything he was doing, speaking softly, all the while, not for their understanding, but for his own courage. "Just trying to help," he whispered, more to himself than to them. He placed a folded towel beneath the injured leg, wincing at the way the paw curled unnaturally, the pink of swollen skin showing through the fur. The wolf let out another small sound but did not move away. Gently, slowly, Warren cleaned around the injury with warm water and a soft cloth. His hands trembled, not out of fear, but from the weight of what this moment meant. In all his years in the wilderness, he had seen animals suffer from afar, but never had he been allowed to be part of the healing. He dabbed antiseptic onto a piece of cloth and applied it as tenderly as he could. The wolf's leg twitched, and Warren paused, murmuring comfort again, waiting until the tension eased before wrapping the joint with gauze. His fingers moved with surprising steadiness, not because he was sure of what he was doing, but because he felt guided by something stronger than knowledge, by empathy, by respect. The larger wolf had sat down beside them now, watching every move but making no threat. Warren looked up briefly and met its eyes. There was no way to explain what passed between them in that moment. No words existed for it. It was just understanding, trust, perhaps even gratitude. Warren finished the bandage with a final gentle tug, and tied it off with shaking fingers. He sat back, not daring to breathe too deeply, waiting for the wolf's reaction, but there was none. The smaller wolf didn't lash out or struggle. It simply shifted its weight, then lowered its head back onto its sibling's side, and closed its eyes. Warren let out a long breath. He hadn't realized he'd been holding. He placed the used cloths back into the kit, cleaned up quietly, and sat down again in his chair, feeling like something sacred had just happened. He had touched a wild thing, not with force, not with power, but with care, and it had let him. He looked around the cabin, the firelight flickering across the wood, and realized how different the room felt now. Warmer, not just from heat, but from meaning. The silence that returned wasn't empty, but full of trust, full of presence. For a man who had spent so many winters alone, who had only ever known how to survive the cold, this was something new. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was sharing warmth, sharing pain, sharing the long dark night with creatures who, like him, had known what it meant to be alone. And in that small act of kindness, in wrapping a wound and whispering comfort, something in him began to heal too. The following morning arrived with a kind of soft unease, as if the wind itself was holding its breath. The storm had quieted overnight, leaving behind a blanket of fresh snow that sparkled under the pale, whole sunlight. Inside the cabin, the fire still flickered low and the wolves lay curled together, the smaller one bandaged and breathing peacefully, the larger still watchful but no longer on edge. Warren stretched slowly, his body aching in the usual way that came with age and sleeping in chairs, but his heart felt strangely light, as if the weight he'd been carrying for years had shifted, even just a little. As he stood and moved toward the window, a sudden growl from the larger wolf brought him to a stop. It wasn't loud or aggressive, just a warning. Warren turned to the door instinctively and froze. There, just beyond the frosted glass, a shadow moved. Not an animal this time. A human figure. Warren's heart thudded in his chest. He rarely had visitors, and almost never during the coldest part of winter. Whoever was out there had come through deep snow, risking exposure to the bitter elements. He quickly grabbed his coat and flashlight and approached the door with caution. The growl behind him deepened slightly, and Warren spoke softly over his shoulder. "Easy now," he said. "Let's see who's out there." He cracked the door open, a sharp gust of cold wind rushing past him. At first, he saw nothing but snow and trees. Then, from behind the edge of the cabin, a woman stepped forward, bundled tightly in a thick coat, scarf and gloves. Only her eyes were visible, sharp, alert, but not unkind. "I'm not here to cause trouble," she said quickly, her voice steady but urgent. "Are the wolves inside?" Warren blinked, stunned by the directness of her question. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice rough with sleep and confusion. "My name is Kara," she said, pulling down her scarf just enough to reveal her face. She looked exhausted, cheeks red from the cold, but her expression was one of deep concern. "I'm a wildlife researcher. I've been tracking a small pack that got separated during the last storm. 2 of them disappeared off the radar. I believe you have them." Warren hesitated, his instincts battling between protection and curiosity. Behind him, the larger wolf gave another soft growl, and the injured one stirred slightly. Kara must have sensed his doubt. "I'm not here to take them by force," she said gently. "I just want to help. We've been monitoring this pack for months. When the blizzard hit, we lost their signal and we feared the worst." Warren studied her for a long moment, then finally stepped aside. "Come in," he said, "but move slow. They're still scared." Kara nodded and entered carefully, her boots crunching on the wooden floor. As soon as she stepped inside, the larger wolf stood, placing itself between her and its injured sibling. Kara stopped and knelt slowly, removing her gloves and holding her hands out, palms up in a gesture of peace. "Hey there," she murmured, her voice soft and practiced. "It's okay, I'm a friend." Warren watched in quiet amazement, as the wolf, though wary, didn't lunge or retreat. It simply stared, trying to make sense of this new presence. Kara glanced at the bandaged leg and nodded approvingly. "You did good work," she said to Warren. "This kind of care may have saved its life." Warren shrugged, a bit embarrassed. "I did what I could," he replied. "Didn't seem right to do nothing." Kara looked at him with something like gratitude in her eye. "Most people wouldn't have done what you did," she said. "These wolves are lucky they found you." She explained that the 2 wolves were likely siblings, part of a family unit that had been shrinking over the past few seasons. The younger one, female, had probably been injured while hunting or escaping a trap, and the older one had stayed by her side instead of rejoining the pack. When the blizzard hit, the rest of the pack was pushed further south, and these 2 had gone missing. "We were starting to believe they hadn't made it," Kara said, kneeling near the fire. "And then I picked up faint signs of their movement. I followed tracks, scat, and eventually came across your cabin. I saw the footprints, heard the howls. I wasn't sure what I'd." Warren listened in silence, absorbing every word. He glanced at the wolves, who had settled again, still watchful but no longer alarmed. The presence of Kara, oddly enough, seemed to bring a strange kind of calm to them. Maybe they recognized her scent, or maybe they could feel her intention. Whatever it was, their bodies began to ease once more. Warren poured her a cup of coffee, and they sat quietly, the tension beginning to melt. "You really care about them," he said after a while. Kara smiled faintly. "I do. These creatures, they're misunderstood. They're not the monsters people make them out to be. They're loyal, they feel, they protect each other in ways that most humans have forgotten how to do." Warren nodded slowly. "I've seen it," he said. "They never left each other's side, even when one could barely stand." Kara reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook filled with maps and notes. "We've got a wildlife center a few hours from here," she said. If we can get them there, we can treat her leg properly. Once she's healed, we'll reunite them with the rest of their pack. If the pack's still nearby, Warren looked around the cabin, suddenly aware that it would soon feel empty again. They've gotten used to this place, he said softly, and I guess I've gotten used to them. Kara's expression softened. If it's okay with you, we can wait until tomorrow. Let them rest one more night. Get strong, then we'll figure out how to move them safely. Warren agreed. One more night won't hurt, he said. But deep down he knew it wasn't about the wolves anymore. It was about him, about letting go of something that had reminded him what it felt like to matter again, to be needed. That night, as the fire burned low and the snow began to fall once more, Warren sat with Kara, sharing stories about life in the wilderness, about what it meant to be alone for so long, and the wolves, tired but safe, lay nearby, not as visitors, not as wild beasts, but as something more, souls that had crossed his path and changed him forever. Just when they thought the worst had passed, when the cabin had become a place of warmth, healing and quiet understanding, nature reminded them who truly ruled the land. The skies darkened quickly that afternoon, heavy with something more than clouds. The wind began to howl again, louder than before, carrying with it a sharp, icy sting that forced the trees to sway like weary giants. Kara, experienced and perceptive, stepped out briefly and came back in with a face full of concern. We've got another storm coming, she warned, and this one's going to be bad. Warren didn't argue. He'd lived through enough winters to read the signs. The sudden stillness of the birds, the pressure in the air, the kind of silence that felt like holding your breath before a shout. They had to act fast. With the wolves still recovering and roads impassable, they needed a temporary shelter where they could wait out the storm without endangering the animals or themselves. The cabin was safe, yes, but not for travel. They needed to get closer to the research team's meeting point, near the frozen creek. If they waited too long, the snow might bury every trail and block any chance of rescue. Warren offered his snowmobile, battered but faithful, and began packing essentials: food, water, firewood, blankets, the first aid kit, and every bit of courage he had left. Kara gathered her equipment while keeping a gentle hand near the wolves, who sensed the change in mood. The larger wolf paced with unease, while the smaller one lifted her head with a questioning whimper. We have to move them carefully, Kara said. Too much stress could harm her leg again. Together they constructed a makeshift sled out of wooden planks and thick rope, padded with old quilts and lined with spare jackets. The wolves were hesitant but didn't resist. Perhaps they understood, in their wild way, that these strange humans were trying to help. As Warren loaded the last of the gear, snow began to fall slowly at first, then faster, like the sky was unraveling. They set off toward the creek, the sled tied securely behind the snowmobile. The wolves huddled together, the larger one always touching the smaller, never letting more than an inch separate them. Kara rode behind Warren, eyes scanning the horizon as the storm thickened. What had begun as flakes quickly turned into a white curtain that erased trees, paths, and even sound. The snowmobile roared through it, pushing against wind and time. When they finally reached the creek, visibility had dropped so low it felt like dusk. Even though it was barely afternoon, they found a small grove of trees thick enough to act as a windbreak, and began building. Time was short, and the storm was gaining strength. Warren drove stakes into the hard ground while Kara set up tarps between the trees, forming a crude but effective barrier. The wolves were placed inside the shelter first, their sled nestled against the trees, and extra blankets thrown over the opening. The smaller one whimpered once but soon quieted as her sibling lay beside her, forming a wall of warmth and reassurance. Snow piled quickly around the outer wall of the shelter, but they used it to their advantage, packing it against the tarps for insulation. Warren stoked a small fire, careful to protect the flames from the wind. Every movement had to be deliberate, every step careful. They weren't just fighting snow, they were fighting exhaustion, fear, and the creeping cold that seemed to want to crawl under skin and settle inside bones. As the hours passed, the storm howled louder, tearing at the fabric walls, testing their strength. Inside, the fire crackled and the wolves remained still, their breathing slow but steady. Warren sat with his back against a tree, eyes closed for a moment, letting the heat of the fire soak into his frozen glove. Kara checked the injured leg again, nodding with relief that the bandage was holding. "She's strong," she said softly, "but he's stronger in a different way. He won't let anything happen to her." Warren glanced at the larger wolf, whose amber eyes remained half open, watching everything. "It's like watching a parent," he said, "or an old friend who won't leave your side, even when they're tired too." Kara smiled gently. "Wolves are family, Warren. They don't abandon each other. That's what makes them so special." The wind screamed outside the shelter, but inside, a different kind of silence grew, a silence filled with mutual respect. Two people and two wolves, sheltering from a storm not just of snow but of life itself. Warren couldn't help but feel something sacred was happening, something the wild was allowing them to witness. The bond between the wolves wasn't just survival, it was love. Not romantic love, but the kind that stays through pain, through hunger, through fear. The kind that holds on even when the world falls apart around you. He thought of his late wife again, of the times she sat with him in silence during his darkest days. He remembered her hands, warm and strong, just like the way the larger wolf curled around the smaller neck. The fire burned low, and Warren added another log, his fingers numb but his heart full. They had built something that night, not just a shelter of tarps and snow, but a moment that would stay with him forever. Because in that cold, in that chaos, love held firm. The wild didn't take it away, it revealed it. The storm had passed, but the cold still clung to everything like a second skin. The snow lay thick on the ground, covering paths and prints, silencing footsteps and sounds alike. The sky had turned a dull gray, heavy with more snow yet to fall, but the worst of the storm had eased, and with it came a silence that almost felt sacred. Inside the shelter near the frozen creek, the wolves were resting, their bodies finally calm, their breathing steady. Kara was checking the medical equipment, preparing to make contact with her team again. Warren stepped out into the trees to gather more firewood, needing both the warmth and the motion to ease his stiff legs and crowded thoughts. The trees stood like frozen sentinels, tall and still, as Warren trudged through the snow with a small hatchet in one hand and his senses on high alert. Every sound was louder in the quiet aftermath. Branches cracking, birds returning to the sky, the low groan of ice shifting beneath deep layers of snow. As he moved deeper into the woods, looking for dry wood that hadn't been soaked by the storm, something made him stop. A faint noise, so soft it could have been the wind, but different. It was a cry not human, not loud, but so full of sadness it stopped Warren in his track. He turned, squinting through the trees, and spotted faint tracks, small uneven paw prints, that dragged in places, as though left by something wounded and weak. His heart skipped a beat. These were not the tracks of the two wolves already in his care. These were fresh, different, smaller, lighter. Trembling with a strange urgency, Warren followed the tracks, stepping carefully, whispering softly as he went. "It's all right. I'm not here to hurt you." The cry came again, closer now, and then he saw it. Beneath a crooked spruce, half hidden by fallen ransons and snow, lay a third wolf. It was younger, thinner, and limping badly, its left front leg twisted awkwardly beneath its body. Its fur was matted with ice and dirt, its sides rising and falling in fast, frightened breaths. When its eyes met Warren's, there was no growl, no snarl, just pure, aching fear. But also, something else, recognition, as if this wolf too had been searching, and had finally found the scent of safety. Warren dropped to one knee, keeping his hands visible, speaking softly. "You're not alone anymore. We've got you now." The wolf didn't run. It didn't move at all. It just stared, frozen between trust and instinct. Warren knew he couldn't carry it back alone. He needed help. He pulled out the radio Kara had given him, and called for backup. Within minutes, a man named Dan, Kara's teammate, appeared, his boots crunching in the snow, as he moved quickly toward Warren's voice. Together, the two men approached the wolf slowly. Dan had a blanket and a soft rope harness, used for rescues. "It's okay," Warren whispered. "We're going to help you." With slow hands and steady breath, they wrapped the wolf in the blanket, securing the harness gently. The wolf whimpered, but didn't struggle. It was as if it knew resistance would only make things worse. Once secure, they began the slow walk back toward the shelter. The snow made the journey harder, the sled heavier, but they pushed forward. Warren kept one hand on the blanket the whole time, murmuring soft words to reassure the fragile creature beneath. When they reached the shelter, the reaction was immediate. The two wolves inside stirred at once. The larger one stood first, eyes sharp and wide, ears perked forward. The smaller, injured one lifted her head, then let out a soft sound, a sound that cut through Warren, like a song remembered from childhood. It was a whine, a cry, but also something deeper, a call. The moment the third wolf was brought close, the energy inside the shelter changed. The larger wolf stepped forward, eyes locked on the bundle in Dan's arm. When the blanket was gently opened, revealing the weak, shaking figure inside, a soft shared sound filled the space, a sound of recognition. The larger wolf approached first, slowly, almost reverently. It sniffed the younger wolf, then nuzzled gently. The smaller bandaged wolf followed, limping slightly but moving with all the strength she had. The third wolf, barely able to lift its head, let out a broken, joy-filled whimper. The reunion was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet, tender, like a reunion between souls that had nearly lost each other. There was no snarling, no challenge for dominance, only touches, soft cries, and tails slowly beginning to wag. Warren stepped back, eyes stinging. He had seen many things in the wilderness, but never this, never a family finding each other again, after almost freezing to death apart. He realized, standing there in the snow, that these wolves were not just animals surviving the winter. They were love in its purest form, love that doesn't give up, love that searches through storms, that limps through snow, that doesn't stop until it finds its own. Dan wiped his face with a gloved hand, saying nothing. Kara returned shortly after, and knelt by the wolves, her eyes wide with disbelief and wonder. "That's him," she whispered. "That's the youngest. We thought he was gone." Warren just nodded, not trusting his voice. The wolves curled together again, this time with 3 bodies instead of 2. Their warmth, their unity was a living thing. It spread through the shelter, pushing away the cold, melting even the snow beneath them. That night, as the wind picked up again, Warren sat by the fire, staring at the reunited trio. He thought of all the things he'd believed about wolves, how they were dangerous, unpredictable, but now, all he saw was family. And as he watched the way the largest wolf rested its head on the smallest one's back, and the middle wolf tucked in close to both, he felt something shift in his heart. He saw in them what he'd once had, what he'd lost, and what, in some unexpected way, he had found again. The moment the third wolf entered the clearing, the entire forest seemed to pause. The snowflakes drifted slower, like even the wind held its breath in reverence of what was unfolding. The other 2 wolves, who had been huddled together for warmth beneath the skeletal branches of an old pine tree, instantly lifted their heads, their ears perked, their eyes widened, and in them burned a recognition so deep, so primal, it defied all the silence and separation that had come before. There was no growling, no tension, only the softest vibrations of joy and relief, as they sensed the presence of the one who had been lost. In that quiet forest, under snow and sky, 3 souls who had almost died alone were together again. Their paws sank softly into the thick blanket of snow, leaving gentle prints that told a story of survival and reunion. A hush fell over the world as the third wolf approached, each step careful, almost hesitant, as though stepping into a dream. Their breaths mingled in the cold air, steam rising in delicate wisps, like silent prayers, answered at last. Snowflakes clung to their fur like tiny crystals, glinting like stars against the backdrop of a pale sky. The forest around them seemed to glow with a newfound warmth, as if celebrating the return of a lost sibling. Heartbeats thrummed in unison, a rhythmic song of life, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Each touch of nose and cheek was a vow renewed, that none of them would ever face the long dark night alone again. Time lost meaning in that moment. The past hardships and scars were washed away by the purity of their reunion. Above them the world held its breath, acknowledging that some connections transcend everything, even the harshest of winters. Their paws sank softly into the thick blanket of snow, leaving gentle prints that told a story of survival and reunion. A hush fell over the world as the third wolf approached, each step careful, almost hesitant, as though stepping into a dream. Their breaths mingled in the cold air, steam rising in delicate wisps, like silent prayers, answered at last. Snowflakes clung to their fur like tiny crystals, glinting like stars against the backdrop of a pale sky. The forest around them seemed to glow with a newfound warmth, as if celebrating the return of a lost sibling. Heartbeats thrummed in unison, a rhythmic song of life, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Each touch of nose and cheek was a vow renewed, that none of them would ever face the long dark night alone again. Time lost meaning in that moment. The past hardships and scars were washed away by the purity of their reunion. Above them the world held its breath, acknowledging that some connections transcend everything, even the harshest of winter. Their paws sank softly into the thick blanket of snow, leaving gentle prints that told a story of survival and reunion. A hush fell over the world as the third wolf approached, each step careful, almost hesitant, as though stepping into a dream. Their breaths mingled in the cold air, steam rising in delicate wisps, like silent prayers, answered at last. Snowflakes clung to their fur like tiny crystals, glinting like stars against the backdrop of a pale sky. The forest around them seemed to glow with a newfound warmth, as if celebrating the return of a lost sibling. Heartbeats thrummed in unison, a rhythmic song of life, hope, and the unbreakable bonds of family. Each touch of nose and cheek was a vow renewed, that none of them would ever face the long dark night alone again. Time lost meaning in that moment. The past hardships and scars were washed away by the purity of their reunion. Above them the world held its breath, acknowledging that some connections transcend everything, even the harshest of winter. The team finally cleared the road after so many long hours. Every shovel of snow and every heave of fallen branches driven by the promise of something greater than themselves. Warren stood in the dusk light, breath creating little clouds in the icy air, as he and the others prepared to load the wolves into crates that would carry them to the center where they could heal fully. His heart ached at the thought of saying goodbye to these creatures he had come to know, creatures who had once been lost, frightened, and alone, but who now trusted him enough to step gently into a cage that represented safety, care, and the chance to live. He carefully guided each wolf forward one by one, his hands steady despite the ache in his chest, whispering soft reassurances that he hoped they could understand. The first wolf, tall and lean, moved with cautious dignity, its eyes reflecting gratitude and something like hope. The second, smaller and more wary, looked back once with a vulnerability that pierced Warren's heart, then followed his lead with tentative trust. Then came the third, the one who had arrived most recently, still unsteady, but already showing signs of the fierce spirit that had kept it alive. As each crate door closed, a soft click sounded like the final note of a song, and Warren felt as though he were closing a chapter that was raw and painful but also filled with incredible beauty and resilience. He straightened up, running a gloved hand over his face to clear away the sting of tears. Around him, the forest stood silent, as if honoring the moment when he let these three souls go, not into abandonment but into freedom. He had rescued them from danger and despair, but now his greatest act of love was to trust that the care waiting for them at the center would give them back the strength they needed to return to the wild. The headlights of the transport vehicle cast long shadows over the snow, and as the engine rumbled to life, a quiet resolve settled in Warren's chest. This was not an ending but a beginning, the start of the wolves' journey back to their forest home, back to the wild rhythms of snow and sky, wind and earth. And though his heart weighed heavy, it also swelled with a fierce joy joy that he had been part of their story, joy that their story would continue, and joy that letting go with love was sometimes the strongest bond of all.